Do you know who I am? I have heard that question in this courtroom more times than I can count. Usually it comes from someone who has spent the drive over rehearsing it, a man who believes his zip code entitles him to a different outcome, or someone who has confused a relative's minor municipal connection with actual immunity. I usually look up from the file, keep my face completely neutral, and say, "Yes, I know exactly who you are. You are a defendant on a docket." And then we proceed. But one Thursday morning, that question arrived differently. It didn't come rehearsed. It didn't come from someone trying to impress anyone. It came from a man who had not yet asked it out loud because he had never needed to. He had spent 3 terms in the United States Senate on the Judiciary Committee, helping write the laws that other people are required to follow. And it had simply never occurred to him that a courtroom in this city would require him to stand in line with everyone else and wait for his name to be called. Senator Donald Hargrove did not walk into my courtroom believing he deserved special treatment. That is the important distinction. He walked in believing the concept of special treatment did not apply to him because in his understanding of how the world works, the rules and the people who make them occupy different floors of the same building, and he had always had an office on the top floor. He came in holding a donation offer and 2 attorneys. He left with a question he could not stop thinking about for the next 6 weeks. If you have ever wondered whether the law means the same thing for everyone who walks through those doors, regardless of the seal on their identification card, you need to stay for every word of what happened next. Because the question I asked Senator Hargrove that morning was 4 seconds long. And it changed everything. Margaret walked in without knocking. She never forgets to knock. Her face told me everything before she said a word, the specific expression of someone carrying information they would prefer to set down and walk away from. She was holding a red case file against her chest with both arms, and the office telephone receiver in her other hand, the cord pulled taut across the doorframe. She covered the mouthpiece. "It's his communications director," she said. "Senator Hargrove's office. They've been calling since 8. She paused. "He says the senator's appearance this morning is a courtesy. He says if the case is dismissed before the session opens, the office will ensure our facility's grant application receives favorable review. If it proceeds, the application will be reconsidered." I took off my reading glasses. "Hang up, Margaret. If Senator Hargrove has business in this court, he can state it from the defendant's position, not through a communications director at 8 in the morning." She hung up. I opened the red file. Carroll Avenue and 5th Street. 6 days ago, 9:47 p.m. red light, 11 seconds elapsed. For pedestrians in a valid walk signal, a Thursday evening literacy class letting out from the Carroll Avenue Community Center. Hargrove's vehicle estimated at 34 miles per hour in a posted 20 miles per hour zone. One pedestrian, Dorothy Park, 68 years old, fell on the curb. Fractured right wrist. Officer Patricia Chen's notes were unedited and precise. When she pulled him over, Hargrove had provided a Senate identification card and informed her she would want to think carefully before writing anything down. Chen wrote everything down. By 9 that morning, 2 of his aides had already arrived at the courthouse attempting to negotiate a service corridor entrance and priority docket placement. My response, through Margaret: front door, standard screening, public gallery, his name called when it is called. He arrived at 9:22. Charcoal suit, flag pin on the lapel, a phone he did not put away when he sat down. He took a seat in the gallery without acknowledging anyone around him, not the young man beside him reviewing a parking citation, not the woman across the aisle with a toddler on her lap, not the bailiff who held the door. He sat with the posture of a man who has spent so long being the most important person in every room he enters that the habit has become structural. He was 4th on the docket. I took the bench. "Good morning. This court exists to serve the people of this city, all of them, regardless of what brings them here and regardless of how long they have been waiting." I looked at the docket. First case. Walter Osei had not been cited for anything. He was 74 years old, a retired postal worker, and he had filed a voluntary witness statement as the primary pedestrian at Carroll Avenue and 5th Street 6 days earlier. He had come this morning because he wanted to be present. He walked in slowly, carrying a canvas tote bag with a library logo on the side, and took a seat in the front row. He placed the bag on the seat beside him with the careful deliberateness of someone who has learned that careful deliberateness costs nothing and prevents a great deal. I entered his statement into the record and thanked him for coming. 15 feet behind him, Senator Hargrove checked his phone. Second case. Priya Nair was 29 years old and had received a citation for an expired parking meter on the afternoon of the 14th. She stood at the podium with the self-conscious stillness of someone who has never been in a courtroom before and is uncertain about the correct way to hold her hands. I asked her why the meter had expired. She explained that she had been inside the hospital emergency room with her mother, that the situation had taken longer than anticipated, and that she had not been able to return to the car. I dismissed the fine and waived the administrative fee. I noted for the record, at a volume the gallery could hear, because I intended the gallery to hear it, that this court exists to serve the people of this city, all of them, and that the purpose of this room is not to compound the difficulty of a difficult day. Priya Nair said thank you twice and returned to her seat. In the 22 minutes since the session had opened, this courtroom had heard from a retired postal worker who came voluntarily to bear witness to something he had seen, and a young woman who was late returning to her car because her mother was in an emergency room. Both of them had arrived on time, waited their turn, and asked for nothing beyond what was fair. Senator Donald Hargrove, who had run a red light at 34 miles per hour through a crosswalk full of people because he was late for a hotel, was next. I called his name. He stood, buttoned his jacket with the automatic precision of someone who has stood for rooms full of people 10,000 times, and walked to the podium. Two attorneys appeared from the corridors simultaneously, positioning themselves on either side of him with the coordinated efficiency of people who had been waiting for exactly this moment. Hargrove did not wait to be addressed. He identified himself, referenced his committee assignments, and informed the court that he had reviewed the citation thoroughly and was prepared to resolve the matter responsibly. He nodded to the attorney on his left, who produced a printed document, a draft settlement agreement, already prepared, and named a figure designated for the city's Pedestrian Safety Infrastructure Fund. The gallery reacted, not loudly, but audibly. I looked at the figure. I set the document down. I looked at Senator Hargrove directly. Senator, I said, before we discuss what you are prepared to offer, I have one question. He met my eyes with the patient confidence of a man who has answered many questions in many rooms and has not yet encountered one he could not manage. Do you know the name of the woman who fell? The attorney on his right began to speak. I raised one finger. He stopped. I waited. The silence that followed was not dramatic. It was simply accurate. Hargrove's mouth opened slightly. He looked briefly at the settlement document on my bench, as though the answer might be somewhere in the preparation his team had done. It was not. I opened the red file. Dorothy Park, 68 years old. Thursday evening literacy class at the Carroll Avenue Community Center. Fractured right wrist. Right-handed. She has not been able to write in 6 days. I read every word of it into the record at the same pace I use for everything in this room. I closed the file. I have a second question, I said, and I want you to hear it completely before you answer it or before your counsel answers it for you. I kept my voice at the same level it had been all morning, not lower, not harder, the same. You sit on the Senate Judiciary Committee. You have sat on it for 11 years. In that time, you have helped write, revise, and vote on the laws that Officer Patricia Chin is required to enforce when she is 2 blocks from Carroll Avenue at 9:47 on a Thursday evening. I paused. My question is this: if Dorothy Park had been driving that car, and you had been the one crossing Carroll Avenue on a valid walk signal, and you had been the one who fell on that curb and fractured your wrist, would Dorothy Park be standing at this podium this morning to make a donation? Or would she be standing here to answer for what she did? The gallery did not make a sound. It was the silence of a room in which everyone present is doing the same calculation at the same time and arriving at the same answer without needing to say it out loud. Hargrove's lead attorney placed a hand on his client's arm, gently, the way you steady someone who has lost their footing. Hargrove did not move. He did not look at his attorney. He did not look at the settlement document. He looked at me. I picked up my pen. The settlement offer is declined. This court does not resolve citations through infrastructure donations, and I want that noted clearly in the record, not as a commentary on generosity, but as a statement about what this proceeding is. This is not a negotiation. It is a hearing. Senator Hargrove, you will pay the maximum applicable fine for each of the 3 citations issued by Officer Chen. You will complete a mandatory pedestrian safety course administered by the city's traffic division within 30 days. And in lieu of any further financial contribution, you will complete 20 hours of voluntary reading service at the Carroll Avenue Community Center Adult Literacy Program. The same Thursday evening class. The one that was letting out when Dorothy Park stepped into that crosswalk. You will begin this week. I am also ordering a certified copy of the full citation, including Officer Chen's unedited field notes in their entirety, entered into the permanent public court record and transmitted to the Senate Ethics Committee. Not as a complaint, as a matter of institutional transparency. The law applies to the people who write it with equal force as to the people who live under it. The record will reflect that this court understands that principle, even when others have forgotten it. The lead attorney was on his feet before I finished the final sentence. I looked at him over my glasses. "Counselor," I said, "your client came to this court this morning to make a problem disappear. I am not in the disappearing business. Are we finished?" He sat down. He appeared at the Carroll Avenue Community Center the following Thursday at 6:45 in the evening. Plain gray suit. No flag pin. He introduced himself to the program coordinator as Richard, not Senator, not Mr. Hargrove. Just Richard. She showed him to a folding table near the window and told him his student for the evening was already seated. Walter Osei looked up from the table without any particular expression and said good evening. They began. Walter did not acknowledge the intersection on the first Thursday. He did not acknowledge it on the second. He came to be taught, and he worked with the specific, unhurried focus of someone who has decided that this matters and has allocated the appropriate amount of himself to it. At the end of the second session, Walter said, "See you next week," picked up his canvas tote, and left. By the third Thursday, Hargrove had stopped checking his phone before class. By the fourth, he had learned about the grandson. Walter was working toward a specific goal, a children's illustrated history of the Postal Service, because his grandson wanted to be a mail carrier and Walter wanted to be able to read it with him and understand why the boy cared so much about it. On the fifth Thursday, Hargrove arrived 10 minutes early. He placed a copy of the book on the table before Walter sat down. Walter picked it up. He looked at the cover for a long moment. Then he set it down, opened it to the first page, and said, "Read me that." Somewhere between the fourth Thursday and the fifth, Hargrove called Dorothy Park, not through a staffer, not with prepared remarks or a communication strategy. He called her himself from his own phone in the evening, and when she answered, he told her who he was and said he was calling because he owed her a conversation, not a transaction, and he wanted to know how her wrist was healing. She did not hang up. They spoke for 40 minutes. He paid her medical expenses in full. He established a small discretionary fund through the city's Victim Assistance Office for pedestrians injured in moving vehicle incidents, named, with Dorothy's permission, after the intersection, Carroll and Fifth. He co-sponsored the Pedestrian Visibility and Accountability Act with a senator from the opposite party, mandatory pedestrian safety certification for all sitting federal legislators every 2 years. Removal of the informal professional courtesy that has historically made traffic citations against elected officials an administrative rarity. Officer Patricia Chin was formally commended through his office as a matter of record. He did all of this before he came back to court. He did not tell anyone he was doing it. He simply did it. 6 weeks after the sentencing, Margaret knocked on my door and told me he was here. I walked into the courtroom and he was standing at the podium alone. Plain suit, no pin, no portfolio, no one on either side of him. He had the quiet, settled energy of a man who has stopped managing the surface of himself long enough to locate what is underneath it, and has decided that what he found there is worth presenting without assistance. He reported everything. 20 hours completed. Dorothy Park called by hand. Carroll and Fifth established. The bill co-sponsored and in committee. Officer Chin commended by his office as a matter of record. I looked at him across the bench, not with warmth exactly, but with the specific regard I reserve for people who have done the harder thing when the easier thing was sitting right in front of them. The question I asked you the first morning, I said. It was not rhetorical. I know, he said. I've been thinking about it every Thursday. Good, I said. Keep thinking. I picked up the gavel. Case dismissed. He left through the front door. In the corridor, Walter Osei was waiting, Candace tote, same posture, the patient stillness of someone who has been here before and knows the value of showing up. Hargrove stopped. They shook hands. Walter said, "See you Thursday." Hargrove said, "I'll bring the second book." He walked out into the street and hailed his own cab. No aid. No motorcade. Just a man going somewhere, the same as everyone else on the pavement around him. The law is not a building that some people stand inside and others look at through the window. It is either the same room for everyone or it is not a room worth having. That is not a philosophical position. It is the only operational definition of justice that means anything in practice. The moment this room begins making exceptions based on the seal on someone's identification card, it stops being a courtroom and becomes something else, a place where outcomes are determined by altitude rather than evidence, and where Dorothy Park's fractured wrist is a line item to be managed rather than a harm to be answered for. Senator Hargrove arrived with a donation offer and 2 attorneys and the quiet structural confidence of a man who had never been required to stand in line. He left with a question he could not stop thinking about for 6 weeks. Dorothy Park's name. 20 hours at a folding table. A children's book about postal workers and a grandson who wants to be a mail carrier. These are not significant events in the architecture of a Senate career, but they are precisely the things that separate the person who writes the law from the person who understands what the law is for. If this story stayed with you, if that question stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to this channel. We tell these stories because they matter. And the next time you are driving and someone is crossing the street, a woman leaving a Thursday evening class, a man carrying a canvas tote with a library logo on the side, remember, they have a name. You just don't know it yet.